This video was brought to you by Henson Shaving. When Trump took office earlier this year, there was a lot of talk about Europe and China moving closer together. And there was some hope that a deeper economic relationship between China and the EU could offset any tariff-related economic pain. Originally, it looked like things might be moving in this direction. China lifted sanctions on China-critical MEPs, and at a China-EU summit, China's EU envoy announced that, quote, as long as China and the EU join hands, there will be no camp confrontation, no world division, no collapse of the international order, and no new Cold War. This was incredibly friendly language from a country that the EU had designated a strategic rival only a couple of years ago. However, in the last couple of weeks, this EU-China rapprochement has apparently stalled, in large part because the diversion of Chinese exports, originally intended for the US into the EU, has revived European anxieties about the continent's deindustrialization. So in this video, we're going to explain why trade tensions are rising again, and what all of this means for the EU-China relationship going forward. Everyone talks about the left and right of politics, but in Europe there's something new emerging, a new right. In the latest issue of our magazine, we explain this new phenomena and run through some of the elections the new right have been winning. Read more by clicking the link in the description. So, the first thing to say is that European anxieties about trade with China aren't anything new. Economists today often talk about the China shock, a term coined by economists David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson in a now famous 2016 paper. A shock which hit developed economies after China's integration into the global trading system in the 2000s, especially after its accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. Between 2001 and 2010, Chinese manufacturers vastly increased their export share, especially in labor-intensive goods like textiles, furniture, electronics, and machinery, triggering severe job losses in both European and American manufacturing. Now, the rate of job losses slowed in the 2010s, but in the past couple of years, analysts have started talking about the prospect of a second China shock, as Chinese companies have moved up the value chain to threaten European and American companies in more advanced industries, like tech and automotives. Europe is particularly anxious about its established car companies, who risk being undercut by Chinese upstarts like BYD, specializing in electric vehicles. The EU and China were actually engaged in sort of a mini trade war last year, with Beijing slapping tariffs on French cognac in response to the EU's tariffs on Chinese EVs, which came into force last October. Unsurprisingly, Trump's trade wars have exacerbated European anxieties about the continent's looming deindustrialization. This is in part because tariffs would obviously mean less European exports to the US, which has long been Europe's biggest customer. But more worryingly for Europe is the possibility that Trump's massive tariffs on China would trigger a flood of Chinese exports into Europe, which would undercut and potentially bankrupt European producers. Now, 15% of Chinese exports currently go to the US, and the true figure is actually even higher when you take into account exports redirected via third countries like Vietnam and Mexico. The massive 145% tariff that Trump imposed on China after his so-called Liberation Day effectively amounted to a trade embargo. And while tariffs have since come down somewhat, there's still a 35% flat tariff on top of the pre-existing mishmash of tariffs, implying an overall average tariff of over 50% on Chinese goods. This will massively reduce Chinese exports to the US, and the anxiety among European policymakers has been that, assuming that China doesn't somehow boost domestic demand, Chinese exporters will just redirect their exports that would have gone to the US to the EU instead, given that the EU is basically the only other consumer market wealthy enough to absorb such a volume of Chinese exports. While this might be pretty great for European consumers, who get to enjoy a flood of cheap Chinese goods at cutthroat prices, it'll be terrible for European companies and producers, especially those in industries like tech and autos, who are competing directly with China. Von der Leyen actually acknowledged this explicitly last month, when she asked China to, quote, address the possible trade diversion caused by tariffs, especially in sectors already affected by global overcapacity. Nonetheless, just a couple of weeks ago, there was hope that the worst of these trade tensions could be avoided. Statements from Chinese officials suggested that China would try to avoid flooding the European market. China's Commerce Ministry, for instance, put out a statement saying that Beijing was ready to deepen cooperation with the EU in order to, quote, maintain the stability and smoothness of global industries and supply chains. While China's Foreign Ministry announced that as the world's major economies, China and Europe will jointly safeguard the multilateral trading system. This sort of rhetoric was widely taken to imply that China would take Europe's trade-related anxieties into account, not least because Beijing presumably saw an opportunity to draw the EU away from the US. There was even a report by Bruegel, which was actually cited in Chinese state media, claiming that the impacts would be minimal because European and Chinese companies actually produce different things, which means they're not in direct competition. However, according to China's trade data for April, which was released earlier this month, that's exactly what happened. According to that data, China's exports to the US fell by 21% in April year on year, while exports to Europe increased by 8%. Now, this might not sound that bad, but it understates the true volume of redirection, because Chinese exporters will have to cut their prices in order to maintain market share. And this also obscures massive regional variation. Germany, for instance, saw a 20% increase in Chinese exports in the same time period. Now, in a sense, this should have been unsurprising. After all, the only way that China could actually stem its exports to Europe would be by increasing domestic demand within China, so that Chinese households buy more Chinese goods than would otherwise be exported. But this isn't easy, and China has long resisted calls from the IMF and others to boost domestic demand. Nonetheless, this didn't go down well with the EU. An EU envoy claimed that China was not taking Europe's trade concerns seriously, and the Commission announced that it was setting up a task force to monitor Chinese trade flows into Europe. At the same time, there have been a slew of reports recently that European diplomats are frustrated by China's apparent unwillingness to discuss Ukraine, or the possibility of China putting pressure on Russia. All in all, this goes to show that pivoting from the US to China post-Trump was always going to be difficult. Not only does China have very different geopolitical goals and alliances to both Europe and the US, but China is also a net exporter, while the US is a net importer. So switching one out for the other was never really going to be an option for Europe. Now, lots of people actively don't like shaving, and it's getting increasingly expensive, with razor brands selling overpriced cartridges stuffed with useless technology. And even if you do pay for all of it, you're often going to be left with a bad shave anyway. Razor burn, ingrown hairs, and irritation. That's a problem that Henson aimed to solve with their new razor. So in typical TLDR style, let me explain why Henson's razors are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, holds blades at a perfect 30-degree angle, extending the blade just 0.0013 inches past the shave plane. That's less than the thickness of a human hair. Now, that's important because it keeps the blades supported properly, unlike many other companies' blades, and ensures a better protection for your skin. Secondly, they're just cheaper. Those fancy blade cartridges are full of single-use junk, which makes each individual blade way more expensive than what you actually need. By contrast, Henson's razor just takes totally standard blades, which cost just a few cents. And that means that you can both save money and refresh your blades more often, so that you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face to try and get value out of that overpriced plastic. Finally, speaking of plastic, those cartridges aren't good for the environment either, with 2 billion razor cartridges thrown away each year in the US alone. That's just not true of Henson's blades, which contain 0 plastic, even in their packaging. So if you want to try it out, go to hensonshaving.com/TLDR or click the link in the description, and then add a razor and 100 blades to your cart. Once you've done that, you just need to apply code TLDR at checkout and you'll get all of those blades absolutely free. Plus, they'll know you came from us, which really helps us out too.